So we're talking a little bit about what some of the economic impacts could be of this current war going on in the Middle East, obviously
Mhm.
both in Iran and surrounding countries. So can you talk a little bit about what folks on the ground here can expect?
Right. So the immediate impact, of course, has to do with the gasoline price, right? The crude oil price, as we saw that because of Iran is, in a way, controlling and in some ways is affecting the trade routes through the Strait of Hormuz, right? Where about 20% of the global oil trade pass through that strait. So with that disruption, I think there will be some consequences when it comes to oil supply. So you already saw this morning, the crude oil price has gone up by about 6%. And of course, it would take about 6 weeks to turn the crude oil into gasoline. So we're likely to see, more expensive gas down the road. But a lot also, I think, has to do or depends on, how long this war is going to last and how expansive this is going to be. Because as we know, the Middle East is the producer about 45% of the global oil. So the longer the war, protracts, and the longer or the more countries are being involved into this war, then the more disruption there is going to be. And again, going long term, if the US is getting involved in this war for a longer time, then there will be also fiscal strain that is likely to happen as well.
How does the fiscal strain impact, economies in the country and for example, Oregon, how would that impact Oregon?
Well, we know that, from the Iraq war, for example, right, it was dragged on for 8 years and it cost the US, $3 trillion. So we're not likely to see that the kinds of involvement the US is going to have this time around, and hopefully not. But we have heard, President Trump earlier talked about 4 days of operation. And now the most recent interview he gave, he talked about 4 to 5 weeks. So the longer this drags on, of course, the more the fiscal strains are going to be. So the impact on domestic economy, of course, is that the resources that are not spent on civilian, projects are being spent on war efforts. And so that means, most likely there will be more tax obligations down the road. There will be spending cuts on some of the domestic priorities. So that is not that's not a pretty picture for American residents. But that said, again, a lot depends on how long this war is going to drag on, and hopefully, it will be a swift operation as President Trump promised to be.
Ripples from fuel prices going up are probably more extensive as well, right? With production and delivery and all of that. Can you talk a little bit about what some of those other ripples are potentially going to be depending on how long this goes?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the short term, things may look okay because countries have reserves, and the US especially, has a lot of domestic oil and gas production. So I think the US in this case is relatively well shielded, at least in the short term. But that said, the estimate is that if the war gets extended and also getting expanded, then the crude oil price could go up as much as $100 per barrel. And so that would definitely weigh on, the U.S. economy because U.S. economy is so, oil dependent. So you're likely to see, gas prices go up and production costs go up and production network gets interrupted. And so that would then feed into a variety of scenarios in the sense that, if inflation is climbing, right? We know right now the oil price, the gas price in the U.S. is about $3 per gallon. This week we actually saw a 2% increase than the last week, and people are already struggling in the so-called affordability crisis, right? To be able to pay for gas, to pay for food and shelter, and so on and so forth. So if that oil price goes up and gas price goes up, that would definitely again weigh on the consumers. Now with the higher inflation, then the Fed will also act right in a way that likely they have to raise interest rates and whatnot. So that would also have consequences on the US economy. So there are a lot of moving pieces at this point. But I think that so far there's not really, I would say, positive impacts on the economy. And again, the longer the war drags on, the more fiscal strength that we're likely to see, the more inflationary pressure, the more affordability problems worsen, then I think the worse it is for the US economy and the current situation.
Are there impacts to manufacturing overall if this ends up being a longer term war?
Well, I think so, because again, oil price, right, is very consequential for all sectors in the economy because we need the fuel, and the production cost could go up if the fuel price gets more expensive. So that could weigh on the U.S. manufacturing sector which again is struggling, right? I think that is on top of the current administration's the tariff policy. As we know, since President Trump took office in January to December last year, we have already lost 88,000 manufacturing jobs. And so I think any cost increase is not going to be conducive to that. Not to mention, the labor supply and other shocks due to immigration policies. So I think none of this is positive, to say the least, right, for the U.S. is to revitalize this manufacturing sector.
A lot of people are also talking about flights, et cetera, with fuel price increase. How immediate could those increases, or how immediate are they usually?
Yeah, there will be definitely impacts on the all these fuel dependent sectors. So you talked about transportation, right? Especially aviation. So we already saw some of the stocks in those airline companies are taking a hit. And not to mention, I think right now in the Middle East, right, in some of the very important international transition hubs, like in the UAE or Saudi, their airports are getting stranded, right? Either because of partial closure or it's just simply many cancellations of flights. So I think that ripple effects will continue to pan out, and so some of them are more, global travel it's concerned. But I think the fuel price would directly affect the U.S. domestic transit. Not to mention, again, once that war goes on for longer and the global travel gets more interrupted and disrupted, and I think that would also weigh on the U.S. Because as you know, the U.S. is such a big international transit center as well. So all of these are connected.
Um, are there any positive economic aspects that come from an extended period of war? Are
Well,
there
I mean,
aspects of manufacturing, for example, that prosper?
yeah, absolutely. I mean, in terms of industrial, military industrial complex, there definitely are gaining, right, with this military weaponry contracts and whatnot. But that's not the part of the economy that would really benefit the great majority of Americans. And war always destroys more than it creates, and so that I think definitely there were some sectors that could be benefited from this. But overall, I think it's a net loss for the U.S. economy and the global economy as well.
I mean, other than gas prices and flight prices, are there any immediate in the next week or so impacts that people here in Oregon and around the US will start to see?
Well, I think the immediate impact will still be limited. As I mentioned earlier, there's still all these oil reserve backups, and there's also it takes time, right, for petroleum to be processed into gasoline and so on. But I think one thing that will have immediate impact is the uncertainty. And so we know, business community, they're very worried about how long this war is going to take on, and also what are the consequences if the war gets expanded and get more countries being involved. So I think that kind of uncertainty is really, having a detrimental effect, because businesses' investments, it's going to take time and it's going to be a lot of risk taking. So with this kinds of uncertainty, I don't think that's conducive for the business community. And of course, if there's uncertainty in the business community, that would translate into how much they're willing to invest, create jobs, provide income growth. And so all of this, I think, are going to have a negative impact on the economy in the immediate terms.
When do you start to see some of the longer term effects? Like if it were to hit a certain amount of time, what would that amount of time be for us to see longer term effects?
Well, I think it also really depends on how Iran is going to counter attack. Right now, we're seeing that Iran is not only shooting missiles into Israel, but also is destroying many of the military bases in the nearby countries like Qatar, UAE, Saudis, and others. And so I think depends on how much they're going to wage the kind of counteract attack. And that would also determine how long the U.S. and Israel are going to continue with their assault. So I think that is an important, moving piece to see, how long this sort of destruction is going to go on. And so that's one thing that I would watch for, right? If, the United States and Israel decided that they have more or less achieved the goal, right, which in their words is regime change, then they may stop the operation soon. Or, when Iran run out of ammunition, right, they cannot assault back anymore, then we're likely to see things come down. But for now, I think it's difficult to see when exactly this is going to end, because Iran very quickly after the killing of their supreme leader, they very quickly come up with a succession plan, and so the so-called regime change is not likely to take place in the very short term. So the likely scenario is the US is not going to be able to achieve the goal in a very short amount of time. So they will have to resort to, create more disruption, more disintegration, and more chaos and collapse in the Iranian economy. And that's going to take some time. So I think all of these would have an impact on how long the war is going to drag on, and then how much the implications for geopolitical and economic impacts are.
One last question. If it were to come to a friendly succession government, what would that do for the economy potentially?
Well, if I think if they do have a sort of more pro-Western new sort of regime, right, then the U.S. may reduce the sanctions or to come up with some kind of negotiations, right, for them to basically remove their nuclear efforts. Um, but again, I'm not seeing that is happening right now, as far as we can tell, in terms of succession plan. The newly, as an interim sort of leader is not more pro, the United States than in the past. So I'm not seeing that it's happening in a way that would satisfy the Trump administration or Israel for that matter. So when it comes to if, right, that's a big if a more pro-Western, leadership is being established, then we're likely to see, the sanctions may be weakened, and there may be more efforts for rebuild of the Iranian economy. But again, I don't see that as a very likely outcome in a very short amount of time.
Anything else you would add that we haven't covered?
Well, I think again, this is a pretty big political gamble. I think from my perspective for Trump, because the midterm election is around the corner, and as we know, the top economic concern for American voters are the affordability crises. So this war, if it can end in a very short amount of time with the U.S. claiming victory, it might just add a little bit on, the supportive sort of voters for Trump, because Americans don't necessarily care so much about their foreign policies or any other foreign affairs at this point. What they care is really, how they're able to make the next bill. So I think this is a big political gamble. If this war does not end as quickly as Trump wants or involve more U.S. casualties and economic damages, that is going to cost President Trump very dearly.
All right. Thanks so much for your time. I appreciate it. I'll let you get to class. Hope you have a good
Yeah,
rest
no
of your day.
problem.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for
Bye.
having me.